Sanvi always dreamed of living with purpose, believing deeply that one day she would find her way. Yet lately, every direction felt wrong, as though the map of her life had been torn. She pushed herself harder, worked longer hours, and listened to endless advice from friends and strangers alike, each suggestion adding to her sense of confusion. But the harder she tried, the more lost she felt. Her mind spun in endless circles of doubt, whispering, "Maybe success isn't for me." There were moments when she found herself staring blankly at the ceiling, wondering if her dreams were just illusions. Nights passed in restless tossing, while mornings were wrapped in a thick fog of indecision. She woke with a sense of heaviness, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Friends seemed confident, making strides in their careers and relationships, while she stood still, paralyzed by uncertainty. Their progress made her feel even smaller, as if she was falling behind in a race she never signed up for. She longed for clarity, for that one moment when the path would suddenly reveal itself and all the questions in her mind would be answered. Deep inside, a voice kept asking, "How do I find my way again?" But the more she searched, the more distant the answer seemed. The more Sanvi searched for answers, the tighter the maze seemed to close around her. She jumped from one plan to another, desperately hoping that each new decision would be the one that finally brought clarity. But each time, disappointment met her at every corner. Nothing felt like the right choice. Friends would share their success stories, each one a reminder of how far ahead they were and how small her own progress seemed. "Why can't I be like them?" she wondered bitterly, her heart sinking with each comparison. Her reflection in the mirror felt like that of a stranger, eyes that seemed tired from the weight of unspoken thoughts, a forced smile that never reached her eyes. She couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling of being inadequate, of not measuring up. She questioned her choices, doubted her abilities, and even began to question her worth. The relentless pressure of anxiety squeezed her chest, and it became harder to breathe as the days passed. She wanted answers, but every time she tried to look for them, everything grew even blurrier. It was as if she was drowning in a sea of uncertainty, and no matter how hard she swam, the shore seemed unreachable. Tired of the relentless noise of the city and the never-ending cycle of doubt, Sanvi decided that she needed a break. She packed her bag, left her apartment behind, and set off toward the mountains, craving silence more than anything else. For weeks, the constant chatter of others had clouded her mind, and she felt as though she was suffocating in the chaos. The thought of being far from the distractions of daily life gave her a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she hoped that in the mountains, she could find peace, even if just for a moment. The cool, crisp air greeted her as she arrived in the mountains, and the towering trees seemed to stretch out endlessly, providing a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. She breathed deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen, if only slightly. Amidst the stillness, she felt her racing thoughts slow down. There was no urgency here. Nature didn't rush, and in its quiet rhythm, Sanvi began to understand something important. "Maybe I've been chasing too hard," she thought. The noise of the world faded, and for the first time in a long while, she felt she could hear her own thoughts clearly. She hoped that here, in the vastness of nature, she could find the guidance her heart had been silently craving. As Sanvi made her way deeper into the mountains, the landscape around her grew more remote, and the silence more profound. She was alone, but she didn't mind. The peace of the mountains had started to seep into her soul, and she felt a sense of calm that had been missing for so long. One afternoon, as she rested near a stream, she noticed an older man approaching from a narrow trail. His weathered face was calm, his movements steady and deliberate. He carried with him the quiet assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime in nature's embrace. He paused when he saw her, his eyes scanning her face as though he already understood her story. "You're searching, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and soothing, like the wind through the trees. Sanvi nodded, surprised by how much he seemed to see. "But the more I search, the less I find," she admitted, her voice filled with frustration. Dev, the mountain guide, smiled gently, his eyes sparkling with quiet wisdom. "The loudest seekers often miss the quiet answers," he said softly. He handed her an old compass, its brass surface worn smooth by years of use. "This won't give you a map," he continued, "but it will show you direction." His words felt like a balm to her troubled mind. For the first time in what felt like ages, Sanvi felt a flicker of hope, a small but powerful spark that made her believe there was still a way forward. As they sat by the stream, Sanvi listened intently as Dev spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying the weight of years spent in the mountains. "Once, a traveler found himself lost in a thick fog," Dev began. "He wandered aimlessly, waiting for the mist to clear, but it never did. For hours he stood frozen, paralyzed by his inability to see the way ahead. In his frustration, he called out to an elder who lived nearby. The elder, seeing the traveler's distress, told him, 'Fog clears for those who keep moving. It doesn't part for those who stand still.'" Dev paused, letting his words sink in. Sanvi absorbed the meaning, feeling the weight of his wisdom. "What did the traveler do?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Dev smiled. "He took one step, just one. And as he moved forward, the fog began to lift, slowly revealing the path that had always been there." He looked at Sanvi with a knowing gaze. "You wait for clarity to act, but action brings clarity." Sanvi felt a stirring deep within her, a realization that had been quietly forming over time. She had been waiting for the fog in her mind to clear before she could take the first step. She thought she needed to know exactly where she was going before moving forward. But now, she understood that it was the act of moving, the willingness to take a step, even in uncertainty, that would bring the clarity she so desperately sought. Dev continued, "Sometimes, the fog doesn't disappear all at once. It lifts little by little, and only through movement can you see the way forward. You don't need to know the whole path, just the next step." Sanvi felt the truth of his words resonate within her. It was a revelation. For so long, she had felt paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice, waiting for the perfect moment to act. But she now understood that waiting for the perfect conditions would only keep her stuck. Movement, even small, was the key to breaking free from the fog. She looked down at the compass in her hand, the one Dev had given her. It no longer felt like just an old piece of metal. It felt like a symbol of her own journey. A reminder that she didn't need to have all the answers right away. She just needed the courage to take that first step. Encouraged by Dev's words, Sanvi made the decision to take action. She had spent so many months waiting for everything to fall into place, but now she understood that waiting for the perfect moment was only holding her back. The fog in her mind hadn't cleared, but she knew that staying still was no longer an option. She woke early the next morning, determined to take the first step, no matter how small. She chose one task she had been avoiding for weeks, something simple but significant, writing down her goals. It seemed like a small thing, but the act of doing it was symbolic of breaking free from the paralysis she had been trapped in. As she wrote, she realized how much power she had been giving to her fears. She had been waiting for the right time, the right conditions, the perfect answers. But she had been forgetting that sometimes, the best way to gain clarity is simply by acting, even in the face of uncertainty. With every word she wrote, Sanvi felt a sense of relief, as if she were finally shaking off the weight of the fog. There was something freeing in the act of putting her thoughts on paper, seeing them outside her mind where they could no longer control her. It wasn't perfect. Her goals weren't perfectly clear, and she didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving forward, even if just a little. Later that day, she tackled another task she had been putting off for months, making a phone call to someone she had been avoiding. It was a difficult conversation, but as the words came out, she realized how much of her anxiety had been caused by her refusal to take action. The longer she had waited, the more the fear had grown. But now, taking small steps, one after another, was making the fog in her mind lift, little by little. By the time the sun began to set, Sanvi felt a new kind of lightness. The fog was still there, but it was no longer suffocating her. Every action, no matter how small, was clearing the way for more to come. She had taken the first step, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. As the days went by, Sanvi found herself moving through life with a newfound sense of determination. Her steps, though still small, were no longer weighed down by doubt. She began to embrace the idea that perfection wasn't necessary to make progress. In fact, the pursuit of perfection had been the very thing that had paralyzed her for so long. Each time she had stumbled or made a mistake, she had seen it as a failure, something to be avoided at all costs. But now, she saw that failure wasn't something to fear. It was simply a part of the journey, a necessary step toward growth. There were still days when she felt unsure of herself. Some days, the fog would roll back in, and she would find herself questioning whether she was on the right path. But she had learned not to let these moments define her. She had learned that perfection didn't exist, not in her life and not in anyone else's. No one had it all figured out. One step today is better than waiting for tomorrow, she would tell herself, reminding herself that even the smallest progress was still progress. As she continued to move forward, the constant noise of comparison began to fade away. She stopped measuring herself against the milestones of others, recognizing that their journey was their own, and hers was unique. At first, it had been difficult not to feel like she was falling behind. She had spent so much time looking at others and wondering why they seemed to have it all together while she struggled. But now, she realized that each person walked their own path at their own pace, and there was no need to rush. Instead of feeling small in the face of others' success, she started to celebrate her own achievements, no matter how small they seemed. Each step she took, no matter how imperfect, was a victory. The confidence she had gained was no longer about measuring up to some external standard. It was about knowing that she was doing the best she could with what she had. She was no longer waiting for someone to tell her she was enough. She had found her own strength. With each passing day, the fog in her mind grew lighter. The path ahead was still unclear, but she no longer needed to see the whole journey to take the next step. She had learned to trust the process, to trust herself, and to trust the small steps that, together, were leading her toward something greater. Every imperfect effort was a building block, a step toward the person she was becoming. With each passing day, Sanvi began to notice a subtle shift in herself. The more she moved forward, the clearer her path became. Decisions that once seemed overwhelming now felt easier to make. She realized that the more she trusted her own instincts, the more aligned she felt with her true purpose. The doubts that had once paralyzed her began to fade into the background as she found joy in simply moving, not perfectly, but honestly. She understood now that clarity wasn't a sudden burst of light. It was a quiet knowing that unfolded with each step, each action, no matter how small. Her journey was no longer about chasing flawless plans. It was about listening inward, embracing the unknown, and daring to move anyway. She didn't need to see the whole road, just the next step was enough. And now, Just as she had once asked herself in silence, we ask you, what is one small step you've been afraid to take? And what might change if you took it today?